Welcome folks to part 11, Basic Impetus How to Play series. In this episode I'm going to try and get more detail with large units. What they are, how we represent them in the game. I haven't really covered them up until now. We're also going to talk about Impetus and the bonus it has in Melee. We're going to cover terrain as well and its effects on close combat. I'm not really going to go into detail about the actual modifiers and the resolution process of Melee. We're going to save that for the next episode, but right now let's get a firm understanding of how these things, terrain, large units, and impetus, work in Basic Impetus. So let's jump right in and get right to it. Now, one important modifier to your damage rolls, to your VBU, is what's known as the Impetus Bonus. It's important for a few reasons, and one of them is that if we look at our army lists and look at the units, if we look at their impetus rating, if it is at least 1 or higher, that allows us to move into contact with the enemy. So it's pretty nice to have. Some unit types don't have an impetus modifier. It's basically a 0, like Skirmishers, for instance, most Skirmishers. They don't have an impetus of 1 or higher, in which case they cannot move into contact with an enemy unit. Not that they can't fight. Obviously, the enemy could charge them, and they could end up fighting, but they cannot move into contact with the enemy. That applies to everyone with a 0 impetus bonus. Now the impetus bonus only ever applies when you're actually charging or moving into contact with the enemy. It never applies when you're charged. So for example, if our heavy cavalry here were moving, they get their impetus bonus if they're moving into contact with the foot. The foot, of course, wouldn't get their impetus bonus because they're not charging. There are other instances where the impetus bonus would be nullified. For instance, for mounted troops, if they charge heavy infantry with long spears or pikemen, or if they charge elephants or Wagenburg, they do not get their impetus bonus against these troops. In regards to foot troops who charge, they only ever get their impetus bonus against other foot troops that they charge. So they don't get it if they charge cavalry. Elephants, they never get their impetus bonus against skirmishers or non-impetuous light infantry. In addition, as long as a unit is fresh, it can use its impetus bonus. But as soon as it takes permanent losses, in other words, it's worn, it no longer can make use of its impetus bonus. So if this cavalry unit, for instance, had taken at least 1 permanent loss on its VBU from battle, being shot at, whatever, it is considered worn and therefore no longer gets the benefit of an impetus bonus, whether it's charging or whatever. It just doesn't matter. They don't get the bonus anymore. So only fresh troops can use their impetus bonus. And again, let's keep in mind that the impetus bonus really only ever applies to a unit that's charging, that's moving. It could also happen from pursuit moves, as long as the unit isn't worn. If it pursues and makes contact with an enemy, it will get its bonus. It does not get the bonus on a second or subsequent melee with the same enemy. So in other words, to get the impetus bonus, you have to have moved to get that bonus. One final thing we need to keep in mind regarding impetus is that broken and difficult ground also nullifies the impetus bonus. Now, the only troop types that would ignore that and retain their impetus bonus in melee would be impetuous light foot. Now, that's something we have to remember. Like in this example down here, if this heavy foot unit wanted to engage these skirmishers, they're basically in difficult or broken ground in this case, which means they will not have, as long as they're in this terrain, that impetus bonus. They won't receive it. So let's keep that in mind as well. Now we're going to talk a little bit about large units, what they are and how we represent them on the tabletop. Now, forming large units is an option available to pike-armed foot or impetuous foot units. And it's an option that we can use during the deployment part of the game, when we're laying our troops out on the table. How we represent that is with 2 units, one behind the other, in kind of a little column formation. Now, for instance here, during deployment, I decided to take these 2 units of impetuous light foot and form them into a large unit, and are placed on the table like this, one behind the other. So there you go. That's a large unit. Now over here, I have 2 units of pike. Again, I could deploy them as individual units, as normal in the game, but I do have the option, because they're pike armed, of deploying them as a large unit, and they'd be deployed like that on the table if I did that. So that's what a large unit looks like. Now we need to keep in mind that during the game, this formation, this block of 2 units, one behind the other, this large unit, is immutable. In other words, this back unit can't suddenly be left behind, or they can't move separately from each other. It stays this way for the remainder of the game. So keep that in mind during movement, that this basically is moved as a single block, a large unit. One other thing to keep in mind regarding the large units is that take a look at the army list closely, because you might find some troop types in a particular army list that are also capable of forming into large units. So it's not necessarily restricted to just pike armed foot and impetuous foot. There might be some instances in an army list that allows that option in their army. So keep an eye on your army list as well for such exceptions. Now we need to look at what makes large units tick. I mean, what makes them effective, and how do the rules work in Melee in particular for these guys? Well, the main thing we want to remember here regarding large units is that for all intents and purposes, this back rank is pretty much ignored for cohesion, damage rolls, figuring out impetus. For those purposes, we always look at the front unit, not the back one. The main function of this back unit, in fact, is twofold. The first is that it gives depth bonus in melee for this front unit, and we'll talk about that in a bit when we get into modifiers. Secondly, this back unit absorbs VBU damage this unit as a whole, basically the front unit really, receives in combat, whether from shooting or close combat. So for example, if we got a combat going on here against these enemy, and this unit fights the combat and receives, say, 3 points of VBU damage, permanent losses I should say, those 3 points are applied to this back unit, not the front, the back. That's one of the strong points of large units, is that all damage is accumulated on the back unit first. And I would mark that. Now when this unit reaches its VBU value in damage, in other words it reaches a VBU of 0, it's removed and considered routed just as normal, and it would be taken off the table. Any excess damage, or permanent losses I should say, would be applied to this unit from that point on. And again, from that point on, this unit will be treated as a single unit, no longer be considered a large unit. And before we go any further into the series and go into more detail with close combat resolution and the modifiers that apply, we need to mention terrain. Like movement and shooting, terrain can have a big impact on the results and resolution of a melee. The main effect is that, as you remember from earlier episodes of this series, certain types of terrain, basically broken streams and difficult, can cause disorder on units moving through them. We need to keep that in mind, because disorder does play a role as a negative modifier to units engaged in melee. So that's a big factor right there regarding terrain and its effect on the outcome. It causes disorder, and that's going to hurt our units when they're fighting in melee. And there's some more specific terrain effects, like being on a hill and higher up, or mounted and pike troops fighting in woods or difficult ground or in broken terrain. And those can cause additional modifiers, and we're going to go into detail with that as we go through the actual modifiers of resolution of a melee. But enough to know that terrain does have an effect on the results of melee, and one of those effects is the result of disorder. So let's keep that in mind. Now let's take a look at some examples of modifiers involving terrain on melee. The first one we're going to look at is this one right here. Now here we have a heavy cavalry unit. They have moved into this difficult ground, a little forest in this case. And as you can see, more than half of the base is actually within the forest, so they're definitely in the difficult ground. And they have made contact with a heavy foot unit who is completely outside of that terrain. Now because they are mounted and in difficult terrain, they will suffer a -2 penalty on their damage roll because of that. Not to mention, they'll also be considered disordered, because these troops would be disordered by moving into difficult ground. So we need to keep that in mind. So there's an example of the -2 penalty. Now over here, we have a unit of pikes. We'll assume they're pikes in this situation. They have moved into this area here, this difficult terrain, and have engaged an enemy skirmisher unit that is completely within this difficult ground. Now you'll notice right away that the heavy foot unit is not actually in the woods. Most of its base is outside in the open area of the terrain. It's not in the woods, so it won't suffer any penalties for that. Pikes would have a -2. But they do suffer the -2 because their enemy is completely within this terrain. So even though they're not in the terrain, they still suffer that same penalty. -2 because the enemy is completely in that terrain. And also take notice that this unit, because it's not in this woods terrain, would not be disordered. So it doesn't suffer that penalty. And finally, we have over here an example of defending a gentle hill. And again, it's usually pretty obvious which unit is defending the hill, higher up the hill, or closer to the center point in this case, as I've marked here with the red dice. You basically measure from the front center of each unit involved, and the unit that is closer to this point, the center point, the highest point of the general hill, gets the bonus for defending the hill. Basically, they're higher up. I know some players like to actually lay a string, a little green string or something across this in some wavy way that would actually represent the crest line, and you'd measure to the crest line. You could also just sculpt it onto your terrain piece as well, this high point or the crest line, and measure to that. So it's fairly easy and straightforward to do this one. Okay folks, that brings part 11 to a conclusion. Again, I hope you enjoyed. We pretty much covered large units, impetus, and the effects of terrain on close combat. In the next part, part 12, we're going to start getting into the actual modifiers and the actual process of rolling to damage and making cohesion tests in close combat. And we're going to go into some fairly good detailed examples of one-on-one melees and carry them through, right through to the cohesion tests. So stay tuned for that. Okay folks, I hope you enjoyed and it was informative for you. Yeah, thanks for watching and stay tuned for part 12.